Hey, Jonathan here. Today I want to talk to you about a few key highlights as well as a few key takeaway points from a couple of really great AWS talks that I attended. If you're new to this channel and you're keen to learn the latest tips, tricks, and tools for working more effectively with data, please hit the subscribe button for weekly videos. Now, the first talk was on serverless real-time apps. And this was presented by Danilo Poccia, who works for AWS. And in this talk, he basically goes over this sample application that he made, which does, it's a chat application which does real-time language translation, as well as sentiment analysis and content filtering based on the sentiment of the text. So really pretty cool. And he's doing all of this using AWS serverless functions. And so we'll go over that in a sec. Now, the second talk was by Jermila Dhas, who works for the FT. And in this, she basically is talking about governance on your cloud platform. So what this is all about is actually some of the benefits of moving to some cloud-based platform like AWS, as well as some of the pitfalls that actually come along with those benefits and how to effectively manage those as well. So really interesting conversation. Now, first of all, I wanted to say that this channel is designed for businesses and professionals who want to learn how to work more effectively with data. Now, in order to do that, you don't need to learn everything there is about AWS to be able to do that. AWS right now is still predominantly for developers and IT professionals. And you don't need to really specialize in every single skill. It's a little bit like saying, you need to train like as a brain surgeon and a police officer and a chef. You really don't need to do that. But in saying that as well, there's always valuable skills that you can look up and learn from different specialities. For instance, if you're a police officer, it's probably going to help to know a few things about first aid without necessarily becoming a doctor. And so when I give you this summary of these talks, this is the kind of perspective I'm coming from when telling you about all these different cool tools. So also I wanted to make a quick mention of how I'm actually using AWS now. So this is typically the first type of use case that a lot of people will do, is they'll just use AWS to really quickly set up servers. Now, why do you want to basically do this? Whenever you're working with data, you have to store it somewhere, right? You need to collect it, you need to process it, and you need to ship it back out to people in various reports and models and different things like that. So to do that, you need some hardware infrastructure, some servers to be able to do that sort of thing. Now, it used to be that this was really time-consuming and costly to do. Now, in Jermila's talk, this is one of her big points actually. So it used to take them several months at the FT in order to commission new hardware, because you actually had to physically go out and get the hardware and install it and set it up and image it and all these kind of things, which was just a really time-consuming task to do. Now, with things like AWS, you can basically spin up a new server in about 5 minutes, right? So it's becoming really fast. And so one of the things they managed to do was they managed to get down their process of setting up new servers from several months to a few hours. And this was really one of the key benefits for the FT moving to something like AWS. So where was the kind of downside of this? Well, as you can imagine, once something becomes like that easy to do, all of a sudden, you're not just getting, say, one server set up. If you can do something like literally thousands of times faster, you end up setting up probably a lot more servers. The friction to do it is just so much less. And so what would happen is like they would suddenly get hundreds of servers being spun up just because it's so easy to do. And, people would basically leave them on and kind of forget about them, or, maybe just spin up a lot more than they actually needed to utilize. And this still comes with a certain amount of management and cost, right? So every time you have a server on, you have it running, it's going to cost money, and that's what you're going to be billed for. So to prevent costs from spiraling out of control and having all these maybe redundant servers not necessarily doing anything. One of the challenges they had to come in with at the FT was bringing in some sort of management and monitoring and security profiles and all of that thing to be able to rein that back in and making sure that things weren't being used unnecessarily. So one of their findings at the FT was that the majority of their cost was going to EC2 instances. Now, just to give you a little bit more background, what is an EC2 instance exactly? EC2 is pretty much AWS's most basic kind of primary service. It's setting up a kind of standard server. Now, if you think about it like this, we used to have to set up physical hardware and computers to do things. So imagine you were running something like a restaurant. In order to go out and build a restaurant, actually put it in the ground, get all the council consents, all that kind of stuff like that to develop the thing, it would be very, very sort of expensive and time consuming to do. Now imagine instead that instead of having a physical store, you have an online store instead. All of a sudden, you remove a massive amount of overhead to being able to do that. So you put this up and you can start getting things running straight away at a fraction of the cost. Now the thing is this, imagine that you can pretty much set up a new restaurant or store or something like that by just clicking a button, right? It's very easy for people to just click and keep on clicking lots of buttons and opening lots of stores, even if people aren't necessarily coming to them, even if they're not necessarily being utilized. Now, the way that these things work is, let's take this example of a store again. So if your EC2 instance is like a online store, well, you can actually turn it off and you can turn it on, right? And you're billed only for the time that it's on. But if you turn it off, then you're not able to serve customers with it. So think of it the same sort of way. Also, the store is a certain size. It has a certain capacity. So in compute sense, you're going to have a certain server with a certain amount of capacity on it. Now, sometimes the demand for that service is going to peak and sometimes it's going to drop off. Now, because of these peaks and troughs in demand, sometimes you want a store which is much bigger, and sometimes you want a store which is much smaller, or just kind of close it all together. Ideally, that's what you'd be doing all the time in order to optimize your cost, because otherwise what you'd need to do is you'd need to go, okay, what is my maximum capacity? Plan for that, buy a server which has enough capacity for that, plus perhaps a little bit more just for safety, and then leave it running 24/7 just so that you don't miss any sales or requests from it. So this is basically the principle of an EC2 instance, or basically what's also known as a virtual machine. Now, since virtual machines, you have a number of other solutions which are really quite handy. Now, you may have heard of Docker, which is by far the most popular way of containerizing things. Now, basically what a container does is, with a virtual machine, you're still having to set up all the parts of the server. You're still having to install an operating system, all of the dependencies, and all of the software and everything on top of that as well. And so it has a lot of moving parts. And when you need to deploy that, you need to think about all of those kind of pieces as well. Whereas with a container, it basically packages up everything that your application needs to run. So a little mini portion of operating system and all the dependencies and basically everything that your application needs to run, and it puts it into a nice little container which you can just spin up and run without having to worry about all these other bits and pieces. Now, going a level further than that, the new kind of technology that's coming available now, which was one of the other key points of this other talk, is serverless. So what is serverless exactly? With serverless, it takes it one step further by saying, look, we're not even going to look at a full app. We're going to take out the app, just a single function out of that. and have that being able to run on its own. Now, why would you do that? What is kind of the benefit of that? Now, as mentioned in the previous example, let's say if you have a store and you have to have that running, say 24/7, just in case customers are going to turn up at certain times, or you can decide to shut it down and those customers just have to get turned away. Now, a lot of times you can't always predict exactly how many people are going to hit your service at any one point in time. And so if you have this kind of fixed infrastructure, you have to over cater for the capacity that you might need. Now, once you're going into like single individual functions, these functions, you basically only pay for them when they actually get called. So they're sitting there like listening all the time for, hey, when do you want to use me? And whenever you need to increase the capacity on it, that scales automatically. You don't even have to think about that. So if you get one request, right, you're paying for one request. If you get like 1 million requests, but you're getting 1 million requests in 1 second, then this thing will automatically scale up to handle the 1 million requests in that 1 second, and then basically switch back off again automatically. So you're only paying for that little portion of time that you're actually using it. And this is one of the things which is so great about serverless architecture. Now, Amazon, they've basically built out entire sets of libraries. A lot of their functions now, a lot of their services are basically built into serverless functions that you can just kind of call into your different applications. So, for example, in this example on this this chat with real-time translation and sentiment analysis is basically using some of the serverless machine learning functions that automatically do translation and things like that. And the way that you access these serverless services is by using serverless functions known as Lambda functions, right? And so these are functions that you write yourself, which then go off and call these other services, right? So really pretty interesting stuff. So serverless basically has this massive benefit of, if you're not able to plan your utilization of a resource and you need to be able to scale up and down like very, very quickly without having to over cater for it, then serverless can be a really good option. It's also a really great way of tapping into a lot of the pre-built Amazon services. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that by using serverless functions, you do get some vendor lock-in. If you're using the serverless functions on AWS, then you're kind of locked into AWS for those kind of functions. Now, there's other providers as well. Microsoft is also working on their own serverless functions as well. But it's a really interesting space. So keep in mind, there is some vendor lock-in there. But for certain applications, yeah, absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense to use these kind of technologies. It's very, very, very cool kind of stuff. Anyway, if you found this helpful, please leave a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.